Welcome to the Femsplainers. I'm Christina Hoff-Summers.
And I'm Danielle Crittenden, and we welcome Beth Crimmy into the studio today to fill in for Ella, who's away. I didn't believe we gave holidays on the Femsplainers. This millennial slacking off again.
Slacker millennial.
Gen Zers.
Had to have a mental health day.
Yeah, or manicure or something. But it's about to get started, Christina, and you go and you spill champagne.
I opened
all
the bottle
over the studio.
because no one gave me a towel. I was just told to open it. I opened it perfectly, but then poof.
Yeah, well, it smells now like, what, a French brothel in here.
It's true.
And I'm not drinking. There's like, by the time this airs, there will be one more week of sober October.
Is there anything more tiresome than sobriety?
Yes, a sobriety evangelical,
Yeah.
and that's what I've become. You notice I have had an effect on you. You have to admit it that you're drinking a little less.
I am.
My husband's drinking less. Some of my friends are drinking less. They're inspired. You know why? Because I look so amazing. and I now have proof because one of my first topics of the week to just inspire you guys who are joining me to get through that last clubhouse turn of Sober October is that alcohol, Femsplainers, can ruin your looks.
It's a key offender.
It's expert reveals
aging your skin.
the telltale signs of wine face.
Dehydration.
Resting wine face.
Oh.
You have resting champagne face right now, including fine lines, dry patches,
I
and
think it's
dullness. And do you know why? Well, you said dehydration.
Yeah, dehydration and
It says the dehydration affects the production of natural collagen, while the sugar from wine can affect blood sugar levels and start a process called glycation, which damages the skin in the form of fine lines and wrinkles.
it's not as bad as smoking. Or
But
the
at least
sun.
smoking keeps you thin.
True. And sun gives you, a nice suntan. But imagine if you smoke, drink, and live in Arizona. You're going to look lizardy.
You're going to look like a desert, an old alligator purse is what you're going to look like. So I just want to inspire you all. And I do notice that aside from sleeping better, my skin does look better, and I don't have that huge red alcoholic nose that I used to have. Did you notice that?
Yeah, it's gone.
And what do they call roomy eyes, the red watery eyes, and the trembling hand, Christina?
But I have a conflict, and we will have to add. We have such informed listeners. Maybe they can advise me on this, but I've had this chronic shoulder pain, upper back pain, and yesterday I went to this doctor and it's called an EMG, an electromyo.
Is that where they poke you with needles or something?
They poke you with needles and then they measure muscle response or electrical activity in response to the nerve stimulation of the muscle, something like that.
They tried it around your liver and there was no response.
No, my liver is fine. No, they just see. And he said that it looked fine, but I still have this chronic pain. And I said, well, what do I do? And he said, exercise. I said, well, I do find if I drink wine in the evening, it takes. He said, that's good. And I said, you mean I have your permission to drink 2 glasses of wine every night? And he said, absolutely.
That's until your liver starts looking fat. And you have to fat shame your liver. Well, my doctor has said no such thing, and I can't claim shoulder pain. But anyway, bravo to all of you who have sustained this Sober October with me.
And
we're going the distance.
Endured it with me.
Maybe we can toast the end of it when we're in Nashville this coming weekend.
You're not going to drink it? I'm not. No, I'm being bad. I have to be supportive. I have to be.
You've been very supportive. To be fair, you've not told me how much you're enjoying what you're drinking when you drink in front of me. I mean, you've kept it to a minimum. But so Politicon this weekend. I'm sure
Not
you can
this.
still,
Yeah.
I'm sure you can still get tickets. And Christina, what came across your interest this week? What caught your interest this week?
Well, so it's always what caused me the most irritation. And this is a story in the New York Times about the sexist undertones of wedding marketing. And they find it remarkable that many brides, but not grooms, are very attentive to marketing their weddings. Well, of course, weddings are just much more interesting to women, and women on average. I know that there are some exceptions out there, but it is something that...
What the New York Times was complaining that women were more interested in bride magazines or something than bride sites?
Yes. Why don't they? Well, the focus was actually that there's this market. It does sound sort of absurd, where you can... there are websites where you can ask for can generate a hashtag for your wedding, and they say that these are sexist. They'll say things like, Smith is joining Doe. I don't know, making it as if I don't know why that it would be sexist. The whole thing is absurd.
Oh, I see, because it says that when you form the hashtag, it's all about changing your name to
his name,
and we're talking about
Hoff becomes Summers.
Yeah, we're talking about heterosexual weddings. Let's just be clear. But then it goes on to note that it says this, the New York Times survey 2015 found that 20% of married women had kept their last names. That's like, okay, that's 1/5. The other 80%
aren't doing it, and would appreciate
so the
those hashtags
are a little oriented around that. But wouldn't you also worry if your groom were more into the flower arrangements and table settings than you were? Would that cause you pause?
I'd be concerned, bordering on mortified, because it's just the wedding is typically something that women, heterosexual women, focus on. And the only people who focus on them more are gay males. Those have been some of the most beautiful weddings I have ever seen.
Well, I don't think the New York Times...
and they ignored gay.
Would they gay shame if gay men were getting too obsessed with their wedding planning?
No.
But I love how the New York Times, I don't even know what was the impetus for this article. It comes out of nowhere. It's like a writer decides, they take something that is very female, and then they decide it's sexist.
And pathologize it.
So the fact that women look at and enjoy wedding planning and wedding-related, porn, as it were, more than men is a problem. Did
you see this line? They say these bridal accounts are focusing more on what a woman is supposed to look like rather than on the emotions of the day. Well, aren't your emotions of the day slightly determined by what you look like? If you look and you want to look beautiful,
superficial. No, but it's also like, okay, they're talking about companies that market to brides.
Yeah, so stay away from those
emotions
companies.
of the day. No, that's like your emotions of the day are from if you're having a religious ceremony.
Yeah.
It's about the ceremony.
Right.
It's about who you're having, how you're celebrating it. But the people who make headpieces are not really interested in your emotion of the day, except, as you say, will this headpiece make me feel happy?
Well, what were your emotions the day of your wedding?
Oh, I don't know that my wedding is a good example. I got married in 1989. No, 88. What am I saying?
That's after anybody married after Lady Di. It changed the whole wedding. I mean, mine was before.
You kind of probably had a
hippie wedding. I think it was 81. Yeah. And it was an Orthodox Jewish wedding, but the party was at our house.
Yeah.
And it was, I think I made my wedding dress. I think I was, graduate student chic dress. And
you made it?
Well, I didn't exactly make it, but I sort of put it together. I think I looked a little like a shepherdess, a modern day shepherd, sort of flowers. It was a long time ago.
Did you have flowers in your hair? Did you look like a real hippie?
Yeah, it was a hippie wedding. And it was just fun. And we there was no concept of the wedding industry. Weddings were out of style. And then Lady Di had her Laura Ashley wedding.
Yeah.
And after that...
No, it wasn't. It was the designers who made her wedding cake confection. Wedding cake, remember the dress? It's the British designers, and the name has just slipped out of my head. It'll come back to me. But, but even then, even by 1988, there was still... first of all, a lot of young women were not getting married.
Right.
And certainly young. So I was a total freak amongst my peers. And I mean, I've told you that our families weren't really getting along that well. Our mutual future in-laws were not. It was sort of Hatfield and
Feuding
McCoy situation, and I was just I just found the whole thing. I mean, I was very happy to be getting married to my husband, but I found the whole thing stressful. Yeah, there was no. I mean, I would have been grateful for this industry, honestly, and sites like The Knot, because we just felt that we had no idea what we were doing. And then the tensions were running high, which I guess, is probably true of a lot of weddings anyway. Everybody's tensions, escalate. And then there were sort of feministy things, like I didn't wear a veil because I thought that would be wrong. And it was just, we then had a second Jewish wedding because I converted 3 years later. And that was like you describe. It was done in our house, in our apartment in New York. And it was wonderful. I cooked. Not 3 months later, 3 years later, because Miranda was just born. She began screaming and howling in the middle of it. She was like 3 months old. And then we ended up singing Fiddler on the Roof. It was so much fun.
In my wedding, my late husband was a philosopher, as you know, and a lot of philosophers came to the wedding. And among them was Willard Van Orman Quine, one of the most brilliant philosophers in the world. And somehow he ended up in the car from the shul to our house. He ended up with my Orthodox Jewish sister-in-law from Borough Park, very Orthodox. And she had no idea who he was, but she's very funny. She said, "So tell me," she said, "what do you do?" A friend of mine was in the car and told me this. And he said, "Oh, I'm a philosopher." "Where?" And he said, "At Harvard." "Oh, philosopher at Harvard. Very good." And that was just a mix of our hippie friends, my Orthodox relatives. We danced. We had a klezmer band, and then we had a rock band, it was just a crazy mix of people. People loved it. It was.
Well, but it's also probably true that the less planning. I mean, you want things to go right, but the less. The New York Times, and this is just such an old, boring point. It would be better to pay less attention to things like the dress. And spending your deposit for a future house on your dress and wedding alone.
They should be homemade. You should have it at home or in someone's backyard or garden, and then just make the food.
But this is nutty. But the idea that women are going to become less interested in
that is not going to happen. New York Times, and they are interested. 80% want to take their husbands' names, and they do care about the romance and the making it charming and romantic and fairy tale like.
Well, okay. So I think we've solved that one.
Yes.
What was? I have one.
Okay.
Speaking of millennials and Gen Zers, and Ella not being here today, so we can talk about her behind her back. Beth, don't say anything, and actually you're part of this generation. Beth, how old are you?
I'm 23.
Oh, okay, so she's
23.
I know, that's so young. Okay, so Beth, it looks like 75% of your generation have quit their jobs because your mental health was suffering. 50% of millennials versus 10% of baby boomers.
I don't believe that statistic for a minute.
It's from the Daily Mail. It has to be true.
No,
actually, it's from Harvard.
Harvard. It's from a think tank or something that Harvard quoted. And I looked at their definitions.
Oh, right, published in the.
And you were called mentally disturbed if they would ask questions like, "Have you had periods where you were sad?" I'm telling you, they have pathologized the human condition. And so if you go through a period where you're blue or you have anxiety, we're anxious because we're mortal beings and you have ups and downs. And now everything's given a label and they've just...
Well, it said millennials were 3 times more likely to experience anxiety and Gen Zers were 4 times more likely compared to baby boomers. Beth, are you anxious right now? Are you okay? Are you okay? Hang on, can we just pause for a second? Beth, are you okay?
Little mental health intervention for Beth.
I think I'm doing okay.
Are you all right? I mean, Beth, you're not used to doing this with two crazy older women, so I just want to make sure, checking it. So Kelly Greenwood, CEO and founder of Mindshare Partners. I don't even know what that is.
Oh, I think they did the study.
Maybe. Okay. Findings represented a culture change between older and younger generations. And she said the first is self-awareness of mental health conditions. And part of it, too, is millennials and Gen Zers realizing they have options and that they don't need to stick around somewhere that will be detrimental to their health. I mean, that's kind of healthy, actually. This sense, I mean, obviously the economy has changed. The types of jobs you have changed. You don't sort of go into the Xerox Corp for life and
thank God
stay there. So, and it's, this is all very nice when we're in a good economy and other jobs are easier to get. But I think there is more awareness that sense. Beth, am I right that your job should be, I mean, if you have the luxury of having a fulfilling job, it should be fulfilling? Is that?
Yeah, I think that's where we're moving, sort of the idea that you don't just take a job because you need a job, take something that you're actually interested in.
Is it also why these companies catering to your generation have like toys in the office? Like they now look like big nurseries for adults with bouncy balls and
toys, food, coffee,
video games, beer. The study also noted that race was a big factor too. It said results showed that nearly 50% of Black and Hispanic patients had left a job for mental health reasons.
Well, I do question how they define these terms because I just think I wrote a book with Sally Sawtelle, One Nation Under Therapy.
That's true, you did. I sometimes forget you wrote that book.
Yep.
No offense.
Here we are.
Yeah.
It was 10 years, 15, 12 years ahead of its time. Well, 10 years ahead of its time.
But don't you also feel that this generation and us in general are more aware of mental health issues, that they're not things to be
No,
ashamed
I do
of
think
and things
there's
to hide.
just a more sophisticated understanding. At the same time, there's a tendency to treat normal human woes as, an illness in need of a cure, when in fact most of this will pass. You will have periods of sadness. You'll have periods of anxiety. You will have periods, that's the human condition. And I think we've now taken it and turned it into a medical condition, and that everything in life is, if you're suffering grief or you had a trauma, yeah, you will be upset for a while. You lose your job, you will be very distressed. But not everything is going to lead to PTSD. There's also post-traumatic growth, which is more often what happens.
PTG.
Yeah.
Well, I also wonder whether, because of the greater pharmacological awareness of treating these mental health issues, including even mild depression and anxiety, let alone more severe, that you get into a reliance that these things should be able to be fixed. That if I'm feeling sad and anxious, I can fix
medicine.
this. There must be some medicine. Or, recreational drug use, the rise of sort of edibles and let alone the larger addictions. That can this be feeding into our awareness of anxiety and then, as you suggest, not being able to just get through these harder, stressful periods? I mean, it's very easy to say, the younger generation is coddled
I don't like to do that,
helicoptered, and
I still think unless you have, you are clinically depressed, clinically anxious, which is a small percentage of people. For the majority of people, there are other ways to address these things: exercise and having a dog. That turns out to be an important.
That was our next story.
Yeah.
It says, want to live longer, try getting a dog. This was in the Washington Post.
You get a cat, it lowers your life expectancy.
That's true. That's actually true.
But not dogs.
Dog owners live longer and are happier. Petting a dog lowers a person's blood pressure. It says, this was a study published in Circulation. that's a good name for the Journal of the American Heart Association. I guess in the column, Mark, the beat. It says it reviews several decades worth of evidence on the relationship between dog ownership and mortality. And after reviewing 10 studies that included data on 3.8 million participants, the authors determined that, quote, dog ownership was associated with a 24% risk reduction for all-cause mortality as compared to non-ownership.
And they've ruled out, some people will say, oh, well, that's only because wealthier people have dogs or upper middle class people have dogs. They controlled for those variables and found that having a dog makes you happy. And that's why I'm getting a second dog. I'm looking for
You mentioned this.
a miniature red poodle.
Sure? Are we sure about the second dog?
Do you think I'm making a mistake?
I don't know. Does,
2 glasses
more
of
important
wine and a dog, and I'm going to be happy.
Except you'll get more wrinkles. I was going to say.
You don't care as much.
That's true. I was going to say, don't drink.
The dog, a dog doesn't care. See, that's the thing. A dog's love is unconditional. They don't notice the wrinkles. At least I don't think they do. Maybe they do.
They also, and if you've had heart problems, like it's even better for you after you've had a stroke or heart problems that the dog really helps you heal. Yeah, and the 2018 General Social Survey found that dog owners are happier than cat owners.
Well, as if anybody ever questioned that.
Why is that, Christina?
I don't know, cat owners. I'm sorry, but it's true.
It's a slippery slope from owning a cat to owning a ferret.
Oh, God. My niece got a guinea pig.
Oh, guinea pigs, I've never understood the point.
It was like having a little rat.
And they smell.
They were frightening. And they had them, and then they had a Ferris wheel, and it got more and more elaborate, and then she got bored with them. And then they sold it. But the whole thing was...
How do you sell a used guinea pig?
Maybe it wasn't... What do they get? They get guinea pigs and...
Gerbils.
There's another thing.
Hamsters.
Maybe it was a hamster. No, it was a guinea pig.
Guinea pigs are huge. And
huge and frightening.
And, yeah, smelly.
The cage was filthy. No one wanted to clean it.
Yeah. Okay, and then they don't help you with your cardiovascular recovery, I don't think. But
just get a miniature red poodle.
Okay, well, did you have anything else before we go to our guest?
I do, but I don't even have time. I'll do this more next time. But Melinda Gates has... her foundation is now going to give $1 billion to be spent over the next 10 years to advance gender equity in the United States. Okay? At first I thought, okay, she's going to, join like human rights organizations and help with efforts in Saudi Arabia, Iran. No, it's in the United States. What is she going to do? $1 billion? She's going to support existing organizations that do not have a good record. The women's groups do not have a good record of promoting responsible research. They tend to be captive to this women are victims narrative. So there's going to be, I suspect, $1 billion supporting the women are as victims narrative. I don't know if we can survive this, $1 billion.
Well, it says, she wrote an article in Time magazine announcing that she's making this pledge. And it said she described that her sense of urgency was motivated by the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Index, which found that at the current rate of change, the gender inequality gap will not close in the U.S. for another 208 years. I love the specificity of that, like 208. Like what will happen as opposed to 207 years?
Just think about that. So Melinda Gates.
Yeah.
All right. So first of all, she is using a fortune that was made by her husband. Fine.
Ooh, burn.
Well, I know, but I'm just want to be realistic. She married the boss. He asked her out for a date, like in the parking lot. Wouldn't that be, by today's definition, where there's zero tolerance for this kind of thing, that would be harassment. So she's going to be funding policies that would probably be punitive towards the way she met her husband. And then when she after she married him and they had kids, she withdrew from the workplace and took care of the kids, stayed at home. As many women, all the evidence we have suggests that a majority of women want to do that. Now, many can't, perhaps most can't now, but she's going to support policies that make that impossible.
Well, it says, according to this article, her $1 billion is going to be used to identify and fund organizations and policymakers committed to these 3 priorities: dispelling the barriers women face at work, creating opportunities for women to scale to leadership positions, and making sure businesses are held accountable for fostering gender equality.
Oh, God, that means more lawsuits, more grievance politics, and more workshops for everybody.
Well, what is something that you think would be productive with this money?
You know what I would do? Well, first of all,
you had $1 billion.
If I wanted to do something for the gender inequity or gender problems, maybe something on work-life balance, and also helping young men succeed, because the dearth of young men with the capacity to, make a good living in the knowledge-based economy, is just creating this gap, and many women are ending up without husbands, or husbands who can take care of the kids.
You realize what a scolding you're going to get for just saying that the Women's Inequality Fund should help young men.
Of course, the education of young men. But see, she has bought into this idea that it's a zero-sum game, that there's a battle between Venus and Mars, and she's going to give $1 billion to Venus. Give $1 billion to men and women to work out problems. There are areas where young men are behind, and that hurts everyone. That hurts girls and women, their mothers, their sisters, if they're failing. And then there are problems where you can help women there, but it's not.
Well, it would help if it was put towards looking at policies in other countries that have helped women. But when you look at sums like $1 billion, I have a plan. I think you should just hand the money out like Andrew Yang. It would do more good. If she would just give us all a big chunk of money, then we wouldn't
fund scholarships. But what I would do is I would try to find intelligent, humane solutions to the growing homeless problem in Seattle, where she lives.
Yeah.
So
I assume there are some homeless women out there.
Well, it's probably mostly men. So maybe that just doesn't count, because that's the wrong team. She's playing for the women's team.
But as we talked about on a recent show too, the people who are really hurting, it's as you say, it's working class men and working class women who are in industries and jobs that are simply not going to exist, not least because of what the
automation.
World and what the world that Microsoft has brought us of this the tech and digital world.
And if she wanted to,
so all the retail clerks and everybody who are going to be put out of business, that would be super helpful. But it doesn't. I don't know. But it's so vague. The problem with these rich donations is they're incredibly vague. They get hostage to, as you say, certain groups with certain agendas, and they never really seem to be groundbreaking. They just seem to be making the donor feel really, really good.
She feels really good, but
institute that will not do
I think
anything.
This money is going to go towards. It's either mostly it's going to be wasted. It's not going to help anyone.
You know what? We'll find out in 208 years.
Or if there's a billionaire out there who wants to fund the femsplainers, we'll track. Yeah, every cent, and then we'll counteract anything that's good. We'll promote anything that's bad, which is going to be most of it.
Yeah, we could at least meet our costs. And speaking of that, before we bring on our guest, Patreon listeners, thank you. We love you. Thank you for supporting us. And if you like what you're hearing, we're not kidding that we may not be able to continue if we don't get more support.
Yeah.
And
it doesn't have to be $1 billion.
It doesn't. $1 billion would be really
$1.
If one of you gives $1 billion, we're made. We're fine, and we'll stop begging. But our minimum, we like $5 a month. But if every person listening right now gave $1 a month, we won't need Melinda Gates. So if you can do that, go to patreon.com/femsplainers and donate $1
Maybe
a month.
We should stage, if people fund us, we can go to Seattle or wherever she is and stage an intervention. Melinda.
We'll look so nutty. I don't want to.
I know we might get arrested.
Yes, I think she has security. Okay, let's talk about, though, now our incredible guest we're bringing on. I really think we can call her legendary.
Yes.
This woman has won 2 Lifetime Achievement Awards from the National Press Club. She's written 14 books, including its recently reissued Washington Journal reporting Watergate and Richard Nixon's downfall. And her name is Elizabeth Drew. We are lucky to know her. She's just kind of come into our circle of friends.
Yes, we love her.
But she has been at the front lines of Washington politics since the early 1960s. She's had an incredible career.
Real pioneer as a journalist, a female journalist, when it was a very hostile environment for women. She was there.
She was on the front lines of Nixon's impeachment. So, and she still is a prolific contributor to many prominent publications.
And she knows a lot of secrets.
And she's a great gossip. And we're going to get her on all of these things. So stand by for Elizabeth Drew coming into the studio.
Elizabeth Drew, welcome to the Femsplainers.
Happy to be here.
It's such an honor to have you, and I'm so excited, and I don't know where to begin. With the go to the past and scandals that you've witnessed, front row seat, or do we start with the current madness?
Well, Elizabeth, you've been in Washington a long, long time. So let's just, before we go back a little, let's have a weather reading from you. How bad is it right now compared to what you've seen?
Like Clinton,
Nixon.
Nixon.
This is the worst I've ever seen.
Really?
During Watergate and impeachment, which I followed for what was a journal in the New Yorker and became a book, which I didn't think about. I called it a constitutional crisis. People were going on about, this is a criminal White House and things like that. And I thought they were missing the point because it was a question of were the checks and balances working. That was a patty cake compared to now. We've never had this kind of total White House defiance of the Congress. And the president saying, I'm just not going to play. I don't like it. You're not nice to me. You're mean. And I'm not going to play. And this is very serious. I mean, the impeachment clause was put in the Constitution by the founders for a very important reason, a serious reason, which was we want a way to have a check on a president between elections. Maybe we can't wait 4 years if his behavior is such. They picked it up from English law, which they all knew, and there was an impeachment going on in England. And they said we have to be able, the Congress and the people have to be able to hold a president to account. Well, you can't hold him to account if he won't cooperate in the slightest. I mean, when they get to, this would probably be an article of impeachment, as it was against Nixon. But this wholesale defiance, we've never seen before, and it's very dangerous.
Well, without getting into the weeds of the impeachment,
Right.
because also it's changing day by day, and I want to get to you because I think we're maybe all a little tired about talking about this current president. We'll come back. There was defiance from Nixon in the sense that he refused to hand over the recordings, right? And didn't they have to go to the Supreme Court?
They went to the Supreme Court.
We now have to do that again, maybe.
Well, they had to go to the Supreme Court to get the tapes.
Right.
Nixon had taped everything that went on in the Oval Office, which only he and his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, knew about. And so the investigators, what we had then was a special prosecutor who had much more power than Mr. Mueller had, and now we don't have Mr. Mueller. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the prosecutor, and Nixon turned him over. I mean, they played games about, there was this very elderly, rather hard of hearing Senator John Stennis of Mississippi, and they kept calling him Judge. We'll have Judge Stennis listen to the tapes and see if that's all right. That didn't go over so well, but they did cooperate. I think in the end, Nixon was a product of the political system. He'd been in the House, he'd been in the Senate, he'd been vice president for 8 years, he was a lawyer, and he understood there were boundaries, and you had to obey the law. Up to a point. And Mr. Trump doesn't honor any of that.
Didn't Nixon, though, think that he was just doing what everyone else did? And, Bobby Kennedy had taped people, and
He resented the Kennedys like mad because, they were glamorous and they went to Harvard. He was accepted at Harvard, but his parents were very poor and they couldn't afford to pay. He even got a scholarship. He was a very smart man, but the parents couldn't pay for all the expenses of his going, so he went to Duke instead. So he always resented the Kennedys. First of all, John Kennedy beat him very, very barely in 1960. There are all these myths that they had stolen the election, which they did not. And that he had been on that one, too. He didn't fight it. He said, all right, they checked it out and thought that they couldn't win it even if they won Illinois. So they forget about it. So he yielded rather gracefully. But he resented the Kennedys for the glamour, and he hated the whole idea of Georgetown cocktail parties. And
They always say that. God, every president say, "I hate
No,
the
not
Georgetown."
really.
They don't even exist really anymore.
No,
I mean, in the
I'm-
modern day they do. Like Clinton didn't like them, Obama didn't like them, George W. didn't like them.
Jimmy Carter banned them.
Yeah,
no, Clinton went to them. Clinton was social with Georgetown people.
yeah.
Obama, he didn't have time. None of them have time. But you make the time. But the Clintons got around.
And also, they don't really exist anymore, and that's something I wanted to ask you about. But let's go back to, as you called her, Little Lizzie Brenner. Mm-hmm. I think you said that ironically. I can't
said
ever
Lizzie
imagine.
Brenner. I didn't say little, but I was little.
You said when Lizzie Brenner was growing up in Cincinnati, you didn't want to live your mother's life playing canasta and mahjong. So tell us a little bit about your upbringing, and you kind of, as you put it, you fell into journalism. It was a series of accidents, which I think is how careers used to go for a lot of people back then. I mean, unless you were training to be a doctor or something.
That's right.
This whole sort of career focused of
So much
a
of it
modern
is just sort of accident and luck.
Right.
Being at the right
Absolutely.
place at the right time. Although you had a Wellesley education.
Yes,
Wellesley
but that
College.
didn't train you for anything.
Except the MRS degree, as they called it.
Well, yes, when as we were heading towards graduation, my classmates had what I called ring fever. They desperately wanted to get engaged because they didn't know what else to do. Women didn't have many opportunities then. I think in our class, one went to medical school, one went to law school. A number of them went into teaching. That's something that women had been accepted in for a very long time. But mostly, they didn't have a clue. I didn't have a clue what I was going to do, but I was not anxious to get engaged.
And this is immediately post-World War II, right? So women had
not
been
that-
not that far.
No, but it was like the late 50s. I mean, it was still close. Women had been working through World War II and then came out, and then there was this, as we learn it, great domestic.
This was a very different world than the post-World War II period. It was much later, as sociologically, it was
Yeah.
much later.
Although now when you look back, you think, I used to think the Vietnam War was 100 years away from when I was born, and in fact, I was still a small child while it was going on.
I protested it. I was a teenager.
Yeah, but you were in that 50. You grew up in that sort of 50s,
In the 50s,
eras,
in the
right?
50s.
And so it was the cult of domesticity, as they called it, and if you didn't have to work as a woman, you didn't, right?
Wellesley had a saying, non ministrari sed ministrari, which we loosely translate as not to be ministers, but ministers' wives. Mm-hmm. And most of us didn't know what we were going to do. As I say, many panicked and got married right away. I didn't have a clue what I was going to do. They sent out recruiters from various places for examples, and there's some lady came who worked for the telephone company, took complaints for the telephone company. She thought it was fascinating, and I must say I wasn't very drawn to it. And I accidentally, because I had a boyfriend at the law school near there, and he knew somebody who was leaving a job as secretary and receptionist for some architects in Cambridge. So that was a good job. And I went to probably the biggest investment in my future I made was I went to secretarial school at night. And I learned to type. I'm a very fast typist. And
You learned shorthand.
speed writing.
Speed writing.
Speed writing.
Oh,
And I sometimes can figure out what I wrote, and I sometimes can't.
Is that like Pittman? It was Pittman's shorthand that my mother, she was a journalist at about the same time. She knew Pittman's shorthand and she
I
taught
don't know
it
whose
to me.
it was, but it's a shorthand. And, I still do some of it, but I sometimes have to stare long and hard. To
My
see
mom
what
does
it
her grocery list still in Pittman's shorthand. No one can read it except her.
is. Anyway, so I didn't have a clue what I was going to do. And I worked for these architects, and they were low on business, and so they took turns bringing in their slides and teaching me architecture, which was great fun. But then they couldn't afford me. And so I was walking the streets, and I went into, somebody said, go see Emily Flint at the Atlantic, which was at 8 Arlington Street in Boston, right
Yeah, I've
facing
been to the
park.
office.
And Emily Flint said, we don't have anything, but there's this thing upstairs. It was sort of a mom and pop shop, and they put out a magazine called The Writer. Now, I didn't think about writing, but it was like a trade magazine for freelance writers. Mm-hmm. And I was an editorial assistant, so it made me have a vague relationship with a sentence, which...
So you didn't like practice writing in school? You didn't?
No, I didn't major in English because I didn't want to take writing courses, but that was creative writing, which I still can't do.
What did you major in?
Political science, but by accident, again, I didn't want to major in English, as I said, because I didn't want to take the writing courses, which was creative writing. But I was heavy on history and heavy on English, and just marginally major in political science. But then political science went off the rails. I thought it got very technical and quantitative, and if you can't count it, it didn't happen.
Right.
So that when I launched the subject of money in politics, I said, well, I got really slammed in reviews because the political scientists, somebody said to me, the political scientists are all mad at you. And, it was not invented here, but they said you didn't quantify it. You didn't prove that money bought a bill. I said, I didn't say that. It buys access.
Right.
But they were very harsh.
This was later. This was much later.
It was later when I was writing for the New Yorker, but I'm just saying the kinds of things that you run into. So then I decided to come to Washington. I had been here as an intern during college, and I noticed the enormous difference between what Ms. Overacker taught us in political science and seeing these human beings interact. It fascinated me. And so I came down without having a clue what I was going to do. And somebody said, you ought to go to Congressional Quarterly. You'll learn a lot about, following Congress. That's what they did, really. And you worked from the documents. You worked from the congressional record. You weren't allowed to go to the Hill until I insisted when we had a civil rights filibuster.
And you couldn't use adjectives.
Couldn't use adjectives. It was all very, very dry. But I just learned a tremendous amount. I was offered a 6-month temporary job, and I ended up staying 5 years and did, almost every job there. And I learned how to read a bill. I can still remember going to the Justice Department. That's when we were liberated and could actually go out on an interview. And I went to the Justice Department during the civil rights fight. And this man kept saying, you must be a lawyer. I said, no, I know how to read a bill. So, you learn things like that.
It's hard to read a bill.
It is hard
look
to
at
read
the
a
bills
bill.
and
And
what
to
are
put
they
it-
talking about? You have to learn this. It's all in this strange,
Right. But then,
legalese.
and you learn how to put it into English and explain it.
Right.
So that was invaluable education for me.
But you talk about, well, then I went to Washington, and I'd been here as an intern. I mean,
Yeah, who does that? I mean,
who
that
does
takes...
that? You're a young woman. You said you didn't have any idea of really what you wanted to do, but you had some drive, clearly, and you were interested in politics and history.
Just to move from Boston to D.C. and then look for it.
Yeah, I knew about 3 people when I moved here, but I had been very affected by having been here as an intern and seeing how interesting it was. And, I was getting a little old for the graduate school boyfriends, and the law school guy and I broke up. And so I thought, why don't I go to Washington?
Why do you think? I mean, it just happens
Ask me
that
why
what
we
you
broke up.
what no
But you can tell us.
to help. Yeah, why did you break up?
I can't remember.
Was he a Harvard man?
Harvard Law School.
Oh my God! Well, anyway, no. It's just amazing to me because you were a pioneer. I mean, women just didn't do that. It was unheard of. Your parents didn't make a fuss.
No, I think they were a little puzzled as to what was going on. I think my mother wanted, but if my mother had her way, I'd have stayed in Cincinnati and married Johnny Frank, whose family owned something called the Frank Tea and Spice Company. I think they did Skippy peanut butter. And
You could have been the Skippy peanut butter fortune.
Mrs. Skippy. But
I'm with your mom,
I'm
man.
with your mom. Come on.
and I'd have, I'd married Johnny Frank. He wasn't interested in me at all, but
It never matters with mothers.
and gone to the country club and done all those things. And I thought I'd be bored silly, but it wasn't a serious option. I just didn't, I wanted to learn. I wanted to see more of the world. Now, I was a kind of independent soul. I mean, while I was at CQ, I had piled up a lot of vacation time, and I took 6 weeks off and went around the world on my own. I just was adventurous.
What year was that, approximately?
Oh, 1959,
Oh, my
60,
God.
something like that.
That was a great time to go around the world.
No, early 60s. It was early 60s.
And the dollar went a long way.
And did you have siblings?
I have had. He's passed away. An older brother, 7 years older though. So
Right.
we were good friends, but we were sort of leading very different lives.
You stayed
at
in
that point.
Cincinnati?
Yeah, for a while, and then
Yeah. All right. So you come here, you get involved in congressional politics, and then you start to become a journalist. You start to become a reporter. Tell us a little bit about that. And the first thing you covered, you mentioned, was the civil rights filibuster.
Well, it covered the Civil Rights Bill for CQ. And there was the long filibuster. This was very exciting stuff. A civil rights bill.
And were you political? Like were you excited? I mean, were you part of the '60s excitement of these big
Well, I
changes
wasn't
going on?
burning my brow or anything like that.
No.
No, I was just very interested.
Yeah.
And I find politics, and I found politics interesting because it's people and how they interact and who is smart about it and who isn't smart about it and how they form alliances or fail to. And this filibuster went on, and I developed a huge crush over a man named Russell Baker, who was covering the Senate for the New York Times, which made him kind of a god. And he kind of looked like Gary Cooper. I mean, he was just lovely.
He was a dreamboat.
He really was. We confessed later that we each had a crush on the other. Much later in life, it was rather sweet. So, and Russ said to me one night I'm name dropping, I don't mean to, but he said to me one night when we were having dinner and waiting for the filibuster, he said, being in Washington is like being in constant graduate school. You keep learning. So you have this issue, you have a trade issue, and I learned about creeping red fescue or something like that. And then you have a civil rights issue, you have a housing issue. You just learn a lot.
You learn a lot. You're constantly studying. I agree. Being a journalist, you're an eternal student because suddenly you have to be an expert on something.
That's right.
And then find out all about it. And then you get to move on to the next thing. But you had a great mind. You had a fine mind, and at an exciting time. And have a fun. But so few women were doing that. That's just the thing. Did you read Betty Friedan? Were you a self-consciously, aspiring feminist?
No.
Why not? I mean, that was also obviously.
Did you know Betty?
That was later. I tell you, I name drop. I did know Gloria Steinem because somebody had said you ought to meet her, and then we were going to this Vienna Youth Festival. It was sort of the commies versus the non-commies in the world. And in Gloria, and after that, we stayed friendly. She was in New York, but she had a gentleman here in Washington, and she'd come down to see him. And we often had breakfast. And she said to me one morning, I think I'm going to start a movement. And I said, oh, what's that? And she said, women. And to my everlasting disgrace, I didn't know what she was talking about. I mean, I did, but I didn't.
You didn't, yeah.
And so, no, I was not part of any movement. I just did my thing.
Well, you had said that you had gone into, once you left Congressional Quarterly, I guess you had decided that this is what you wanted to do. You wanted to keep reporting, being part of the center of politics. And the first time you went to apply for a job, you were told we don't hire women.
That's right. And that was at somebody very famous said that. And
you can tell us who it is. We won't tell anyone.
I sort of let him rest in peace.
Okay.
But this was all over the place. Wall Street Journal was starting something called the National Observer, something like that. And again, this man was Alan Otten, a wonderful reporter, nice man. And he said, I'd love to have you do that, but we're not going to hire women.
We got it out of her.
Why didn't they? Why do you think it was? Well, it was just the way things were.
It's the way things
For
were.
politics, because as you know, and you've met, I'm so thrilled that you've met my mom, who was a journalist as well. Not different place and time, but I mean different country, I should say. She was in Australia.
Different continent.
But she felt always that journalism was the one place that really was open to women. But maybe if you stayed within certain lanes.
That's right. In America,
lifestyle.
it was more women could be in magazine writing, you see, because we were hidden, but not daily journalism. It was considered you just weren't to be out there where the men were, where the real reporters were. Mm-hmm. And so that's why a lot of women, went into magazine writing, and myself included. And so while I was at CQ, I did look around. And then I just started writing magazine pieces for something called The Reporter. It's extinct now. And it was a good magazine, and it had, it was reporting pieces. But I ran into a problem there in that the editor of it, the founder and editor, and he married somebody very rich, Max Askley, he was the first of the neocons. We didn't have the term then. Mm-hmm. But he was very pro-Vietnam War, and among other things. And I wrote about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was the fraudulent way that we were gotten into that war. So he was not very happy about that. And then I wrote about, something about public housing and what a mess it was. And he said, "You've insulted my friend. He got the name wrong. You are no longer on the staff."
And thus begin your famous firings.
That's right, a whole string of them. No, but that was actually, I started writing for The Reporter while I was at CQ, and then I was offered a job as a writer for it. And then, one thing led to another, and Max fired me. There were other things going on, who hired me, blah, blah, blah. So I was married then to Pat Drew, and he said, "Well, I can support you. Why don't you see what you can do in writing?" And so I called a man named Bob Manning, and he was the editor of The Atlantic. And I had met him here. He'd been the spokesman for the State Department, but it was a very glamorous job, but he was very in. And he was a nice man. And he said, "Well, what are you doing now?" And I said, "Well, I just got fired by Max Askley." And he said, "Congratulations, he's fired some of the best reporters I know. You want to write for me?" And I said, "Yeah, that's kind of what I called." And he said, "Do you have any ideas?" This was like a Thursday. And I did have an idea because Congress had barred labeling of cigarette packages. The NIH, National Institutes of Health, wanted to have a warning label on cigarettes.
Well, that sounds like communism.
It definitely. And so the cigarette lobby was fighting it like mad, and they managed to defeat it in the Senate. But I knew about that. I had I knew a couple of people working on it. Some of the most informative people in Washington are not famous. Nobody's ever heard of them. They're staff people. This used to be more the case than it is now. They're more buttoned down for whatever reasons. And so you could learn an awful lot from it. You didn't have to meet the senators. You didn't.
Right.
They were very informative then, and you didn't have to talk to them. And so Bob said to me, "That sounds good. Can you do it by Monday?" This was a Thursday, and I sat down and wrote it. And it was in the Atlantic. It was the easiest piece I ever did. I don't know why. It was just in me, and I could do it. And so then I wrote more for him, and I was on the staff of the Atlantic. They opened up their Washington office for me. I was the first person. They had an office on. They found an office on Connecticut Avenue, and I worked for them for a long time.
And then you moved famously to the New Yorker, where you worked for...
Not right away. I needed to earn more. Mr. Drew died, and I needed to earn more. And one thing led to another, and I was offered a television program.
Right.
And it was amazing. See, I never thought, oh, here's me, and I'm doing a television program. It happened. And it fell into place, and I had a half-hour one-on-one interview program on PBS.
I remember that program.
Do you really?
Yeah.
It ran twice a week, and there were some incidents we can come back to if you want.
I do.
And speaking of the problem of being a woman,
You're doing pretty well for a woman who met first time she applied for a job that they didn't hire women. Is this why you didn't join the Gloria Steinem movement? Because in the end, you were getting recognized for your talent.
I didn't think about it.
Yeah.
I just did my thing.
And by the way, ladies out there, that's kind of how it happens. You just do it. You just did it. And you weren't thinking like, can I do? You just did it. But it's an amazing thing about you that you know, because I'm always fascinated with people who were sort of the first.
How bad it was we started this television program, and I did it for about a year or more than that, year and a half, until then it was transferred over to a guy. His name is Jim Carrion, and Ford Foundation was funding it, and a man named Fred Friendly, and Fred said, call Jim Carrion, and I said, I'm trying to reach him. He won't call me back. Finally, he called me back, and he said, there's a problem with women on the air, and I'm going to take you off. This was 1971. And his idea of how to take me off was he put a guy in as the executive producer whose assignment was to drive me crazy. And he did.
Oh, God.
And I had a wonderful mentor. I think a lot of lives are very affected by if you're lucky enough to have a mentor. And mine was a man named John Gardner, who had written books. He became Lyndon Johnson's, it was called then, Health, Education, and Welfare Department. And I met him because I had an assignment from the Saturday Evening Post to write about him. And they turned the article down because they said, we don't believe there's anybody like that. Because he was a spectacularly interesting and wonderful man. And I had to call him up and tell him that this article hadn't worked, and I started crying, and he said, Elizabeth, he talked very slowly, it's not your fault, it's mine. And we became friends, and he became a very important mentor. Anyway, so I was being driven crazy by this guy at PBS. It wasn't PBS then. And John Gardner said to me, your learning curve is over. You've done these interviews. They've been very good. I made a point of not interviewing someone ex officio, someone who, just because he was important in the Congress, if he wasn't interesting, like Jerry Ford. I never interviewed Jerry Ford, who, of course, later became president. But I'm not sorry I didn't interview him.
Not a lot. He's not a lot of laughs.
No, exactly. Exactly. But I did interesting people like Buckminster Fuller, the famous architect, and people like that, as well as politicians. Anyway, and John Gardner said to me, your learning curve is over, and I believe your heart is in writing. He read me better than I read myself. And he said, I think you should go back to writing and stop fighting this nonsense. And I thought, well, where am I going to write? And, can I make a living? And I wrote a highly subjunctive letter to William Shawn, the justly legendary editor of The New Yorker.
And the rest is history.
That's right. And what was known about The New Yorker was that they had enough articles to publish for 3 years without buying any more, because that wouldn't...
And without worrying about whether they would be relevant or not.
That's right. And Richard Rovere, who was wonderful in his day, but he was not well. He was writing from Washington. So, but anyway, I sort of thought at most I would get back a letter saying, well, try us with an idea from time to time. That would be, that would have been great. Instead, right back came in this little teeny-weeny type that he used. Dear Mrs. Drew, I'd very much like to talk to you about writing for The New Yorker. Please come see me next time you're in New York. Oh, well. So it happened. I was in New York the next week. I was...
It just happened to be...
Well, I was dragooned into judging the National Book Awards, which is something definitely not to do. Because the winner knows they deserved it, and the losers all hate you for the rest of...
Forever,
I mean,
yes.
There's somebody who didn't get it, and he never spoke to me again. because somebody ratted and told them how we had all voted. Anyway, I went to see William Shawn, who turned out, I thought I was going to see a tall, severe, and something like the then editor of the Atlantic. Well, he was this little man with these big, wide eyes, pretty bald, little voice, and he was a genius. He was just an incredible person. And he said to me, "I'm very glad you wrote to me, Mrs. Drew. You've been very much on my mind for 3 years." I mean,
Oh, my
but he never
God.
would have reached out and said, "Hey, kid, come write for us." He just waited. He waits for people to come to
Yeah,
him.
well, how does that make him a great editor? Like, what people, we always hear that he was a great editor.
I'll tell you.
But what makes
She'll
him
tell
great?
us. Yeah.
Well, let me tell you how this book came about, the Washington Journal. When I started, we weren't sure what I was going to do, how I was going to make use of it, because Rovere was still writing from Washington. I did some interview pieces, and I went to see Shawn on Labor Day of 1973. I'm part witch, and so...
I've heard that said about you.
Yeah, it's true.
Rhymes with, no, okay. Nancy Reagan.
It rhymes with pitch. I'm a good
Yes,
pitcher.
exactly.
And so he said, "What are you thinking of writing about, Mrs. Drew?" Everybody was Mr. and Mrs. there. It was all very polite, except for Shawn's own contemporaries like Roger Angell and people who were there when he was a young editor coming up. He was a second editor of The New Yorker. And so I said, "I think we're going to change vice presidents and presidents within a year." This was wild. It was not so surprising about vice president because Spiro Agnew was famously in a little bit of legal trouble for just because he was taking money in cash. So I said that. He said, "Oh, really?" And his eyes would widen. And I said, "Well, we certainly can be certain about Agnew, but I think Nixon's in real trouble. All we knew about was the Watergate break-in, and not much had happened." And so we agreed. We talked back and forth, and he said, "Well, how?" I said, "Well, why don't I maybe do a journal where I watch it and I see how he had this." His eyes would widen, and he always got to the point. He said, "That's right. We've never had to change vice presidents, have we? We don't know how to do that, do we?" Which was exactly how to focus on it. Anyway, so we started, and he would call up on Saturdays. And he called me one Saturday and said, "How's it going, Mrs. Drew?" And I said, "Mr. Shawn, I'm thinking about doing something I've never done, which is put myself in it a little bit more. As this is my observation. I went here, and here's how I reacted." And he said to me, "Take a chance on anything, Mrs. Drew." Can you imagine?
God, what an editor.
And that's what was great about him. And you know that at the other end is somebody with perfect taste. He's not going to let you fall on your face or make a fool of yourself. And he would... If he didn't like something or didn't think it was appropriate, he'd just draw a line through it. We didn't discuss it. It was all. He liberated me. I wrote as well then or better then than just some things I do now.
But he saw who you were, and he saw your talent, and he let you soar.
Well, he really did. And he edited me through that. He edited me for many years.
So I want to know about that. What was it like to be edited by...
It was glorious.
Oh,
It was the Elysian Fields.
oh.
Because nothing was ever, you can't say that. Oh, one of the things, one of my first interview I did with somebody, and I said, "So-and-so has played a central role in something." And they said, "Central is not a New Yorker word, Mrs. Drew." And so you just never used it again. He was very, very attached to language and had very, very high standards. But here's the other thing that was terribly important. He said to me, using the royal we sort of, but there was nothing self-important about him in the slightest. He was this little shy man. And he said, "We tell our editors we don't improve pieces." Meaning, they don't rewrite, they don't second guess. And I had a lot of problems with that later. People who, they think they know more and they don't, and impose things on your writing. But if they had a question, it was all suggestions in the margins, like, "Would you like to move this up?
Right.
Don't you think there should be a comma here?" This kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so you could just, a name drop. I ran into John Updike at an event here. Somebody wanted me to go to. It was a book event. And I started talking to him. I said, Sean made me better than I ever thought I could be. He said, me too. This is what he did. He helped you grow. And I can remember we were down there and editing, which is what I did with the journal was, or what he did with the journal is, we would do seasons. And there would be like 3 pieces for fall, spring, fall, winter, spring, summer. And we were down there like 2 a.m. going through these galleys. And, discussing the meaning of the Fourth Amendment, which had to do with your home is your castle. And this had to do with not just the Watergate break-in. That wasn't the main thing, but we can get to that. That wasn't. Nixon and I both felt that there was something else that was more important than that. Anyway, so he just grew you. And he had your back. And he had perfect taste. And he loved writers. He loved writing. We all told him our troubles, and he would get into it. He was just a wonderful man, but also just a great, great editor. I was with the New Yorker for 17 years.
Yeah. And then that's when Tina Brown
took
editor.
over and fired me.
Right.
And that was quite interesting because I didn't know that was coming. And she had been advised against it.
Yeah.
It turns out I was shocked to find out that the New Yorker actually did polling of their readers. I was shocked. That struck me as a very un-Shawnian thing to do. Because he thought, I'll just put out the best magazine I can and people will come to it and read it or not. That's all I can do. But they did, and it turned out that Pauline Kael and I were the most read people.
Now, did you know Pauline?
I met her from time to time, yeah. But people didn't hang around there all that much. Or if I was in New York, you're in your little office, somebody's office, and just working.
Did you work at home a lot?
Yes, I worked at home. I wrote at home. And we didn't have the internet then.
I know. I think back, like, how did that work? You'd finish something, and then how did you get it?
What it used to be is, like, for the Atlantic, we didn't have the terrorism threat then. And so I'd go to the airport and find somebody and say, would you please take this to Boston?
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes. And
that's wonderful.
and then we were about the last place to get the internet because Sean worried that if we all had it, nobody'd come to the office ever. So we finally got it, but it never worked. I mean, I couldn't make it get up there. And so we'd go on the phone, galley by galley, galley 14, 4th line down, 3 words from the right, please insert blah, blah, blah. This could take a lot of time.
I know, but you look back at the writing of that era, and it was so much better than much of what we have today. So somehow it worked. People were able to edit and make changes and have beautiful...
Well, some people were able to edit. I mean, during this period before I went to the New Yorker, I was sort of freelancing, and I sold a piece to Harper's, which was a hot magazine at the time. A person named Willie Morris edited it. And he gave it to an editor, and she put it through her typewriter. Remember typewriters? And
I do. I wrote my dissertation on a typewriter.
Yeah.
By then, it was very advanced IBM Selectric.
There you are. That was very sexy.
Yeah.
And she just put it through her typewriter and put in her own wording and language. And I could have used being in Harper's at that point, but it's never been a dilemma for me. I just went to Willie and I said, I'm sorry, I can't have this. And my name's on it, and it's not how I would write, so I'm withdrawing it. And he said, okay, but I've always been that way. I mean, it's, I think Sean spoiled us. But he was so right to let people have their own voice and do not impose, what you think about something.
Well, let's go back now to Washington then and now.